Hi, everyone who's already joined. I think what we'll do is we'll give it about 15 seconds just to make sure that we have a full house. Yeah, and I think that's everybody who was in the waiting room. Thank you. Welcome to this presentation on internet shutdowns and their effects on African democracy. Today's generation of African voters have access to more information than any group in human history. For democracy, the internet has been a game changer. In addition to creating new methods of accountability, it also democratizes political debate, giving smaller voices greater latitude to influence politics on the continent. But that's exactly the problem. The efficacy of these tools makes them dangerous to Africa's old political establishment. Whenever the continent reaches a political inflection point, governments in states like Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Uganda cut off internet access to frustrate activism. And that's the issue we've convened to unpack today. My name is Thomas White, and I'll be moderating this panel, asking the question, are internet shutdowns a threat to democracy? I'm joined virtually by three experts in human rights and politics. The first is Johnson Mayamba, a journalist and human rights activist. We're also joined by Catherine Anite, a lawyer at the Freedom of Expression Hub. And finally, we've got Ichumile Gqada, who works with Open Society South Africa. On behalf of the Center for Human Rights, these speakers are all welcome, and we're eager for their contributions. We're also keen on your perspectives, the viewers watching this on Zoom and other platforms. To join the conversation, leave a succinct question in the chat box on screen. Alternatively, you can tweet me at Thomas_White95, and I'll pass your contribution onto our panelists. Now, before we get into it, let's discuss the format. The webinar will unfold in three stages. First, I'm going to introduce each speaker with a question, and they'll have about 5 minutes to answer. Second, we'll have 20 minutes of open discussion amongst ourselves, where we'll also consider the questions from our audience. Finally, our panelists will make their closing observations as we wrap up the webinar. So let's bring up the first speaker, Johnson from Uganda. Johnson, one crucial feature of elections is that voters are expected to make informed choices, and journalists play a crucial role in helping the electorate make those kinds of choices. Tell us how internet shutdowns affect journalists' work, especially in the crucial weeks leading up to elections.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to CHR for inviting me to be part of this great discussion. Greetings to all, wherever you're watching from. I also pass on our sincere condolences to our Tanzanian colleagues for the loss of the president. May his soul rest in eternal peace. Getting back to the question, I'll start with an assumption that we all know how media freedom facilitates democracy in any functioning, in all parts of the world. We know that it's one of the yardsticks that we use to determine a functioning democracy. Because media provides platform for access to information, public participation, and expression. These are summarized in roles such as informing, educating, being a watchdog, agenda setting, and entertaining the public. Uganda is one of those countries that boasts of having liberalized the media environment to facilitate these roles. However, the policies and actions that the government takes affects the proper functioning of such media in the country. One may ask, is there a significant population that really depends on the internet, that its shutdown can really affect flowing of information and expression in Uganda? According to Uganda Communications Commission, there are over 20 million subscribers on the internet. This means that the shutdown of the internet affects almost a half of the population. This means a half of the population cannot participate in the proceedings of, in the activities of the country. They cannot express themselves. When the internet shut down, they cannot give feedback. They cannot hold those responsible accountable. Election period is one of those that are very crucial in any newsroom. And as such, newsrooms play very effectively to ensure that they deliver credible and accurate information to the audiences. 2021 elections weren't any different for any newsroom, particularly Nation Media Group invested a lot in training journalists and equipping them with all skills and deploying them across the country. It deployed over 100 reporters. But the internet shutdown watered down all these preparations for the newsroom and all other newsrooms that could have prepared in the same manner. Throughout the 5-day blackout, all newsrooms struggled to deliver information to the public. We found ourselves going back to the rudimentary way of doing things, whereby we depended mostly on phone calls and text messages. Other media houses, say for example, television stations that rely more on footage and photographs and printing for the newspapers, had to wait for more hours or days for footage that was coming from upcountry to be delivered, and that delayed news. And as we know, news is a perishable product. Some of the information that will be delivered will be would be stale for the audiences. Another way that the internet shutdown affected was we could not verify the information that the government was relaying to the public. It was just one-sided kind of information. There was no verification through the preparation that we had made. There was no fact-checking all that information that was being given by the government. So we found ourselves providing information that is just one-sided, and in that way, citizens could not give back feedback, could not interrogate or ask questions concerning the validity of such information. As we know, the pandemic also affected the way newsrooms affected much of people's work, and newsrooms were not the exception. As such, most of them moved into remote working, and it increased online and live streaming of news to the public. The internet shutdown affected all these activities for all newsrooms and all online platforms that rely on giving information through use of internet. Citizen participation, as I've said, was affected. There was temporary unemployment for those that were relying mostly on media, online streaming. Monitoring of journalist safety in the country was also affected because we could not follow up actively on what has happened to particular journalists, especially those upcountry, because there was no access to information in such instances. All in all, the blackout was not just a dark time for the country, for the media environment, but the entire nation as such, because people could not get information, credible information, and could not verify. Like, they just depended mostly on what was being relayed from the government and as it was being portrayed. So ask, is the internet shutdown really a threat to democracy? Yes, it is, and it is not just starting. It is an ongoing threat. And as we can see from Uganda's history, it is not just this year that it has happened. It started all the way in 2006 elections, where the government first blocked the critical websites such as Red that was publishing critical information. In 2011, it ordered censorship and interception of all calls and text messages, and later it blocked social media and live coverage of post-election protests of walk to work that were led by former leader of opposition, Dr. Kizza Besigye. In 2016, they repeated the same by blocking social media platforms and mobile money services on election day. And on swearing in day, the government still blocked social media, but Ugandans found their way out of maneuvering through the blackouts and used virtual private networks. In 2021, Uganda thought it would be still the same, but this time it came in a different manner. There was a total blackout, as we have already talked about it. Only text messages and direct phone calls were that are the ones that remain active. Previously, the government had said these restrictions were mainly to protect the national security and public interest. But in 2021, according to the government spokesperson, the shutdown was to mitigate cases of election violence that could occur as a result of internet misuse by the public. That was according to Mr. Ofono Opondo, the government spokesperson. The same remarks were said by the Prime Minister of the country. So all in all, internet shutdowns are not just a new thing, but they are a growing phenomenon in African countries, Uganda being one of them. And solutions have to be really found to mitigate such challenges? Thank you.
Right, that's Johnson Mayamba detailing how the recent internet shutdowns in Uganda have not only frustrated the work of journalists in that country, but how it represents a broader trend moving throughout the entire continent. I want us to hear now from Catherine Anite. Catherine, you work with the African human rights system. Speaking specifically at the AU level, what kind of legal framework is applicable to internet shutdowns on the continent? And why has this framework been so ineffective at addressing this crisis?
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Catherine.
Perfect. Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you for that question. I think to address the question, we need to, broadly understand the operational policy and legal environment for internet shutdowns in Africa. So I want to move away from Africa a bit and start with, the global standards. And here, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not binding, but Article 19 really provides for the right to access information and freedom of expression. But more importantly, we have Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which provides also, for everyone's right to freedom of opinion and everyone's right to expression. And this right definitely includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, and through a medium of your choice. And herein lies, the choice to use the internet. And I started with this because the African system borrows from these global standards, which are normative. And then, when we look at Article 9 of the African Charter, it provides, for the rights for everyone's right, everyone in Africa definitely to seek information and to express, but within the law. So we know that that's a clawback clause, interestingly. So they give the right with one hand and take it away with the other. But that was definitely resolved by the African Commission in the case of, I think, constitutional rights and media rights agenda versus Nigeria, where the commission stated that, within the law doesn't mean your national law, it means international standards, and international standards here are the Iccpr, the UDHR, and other, jurisprudence that's coming from progressive courts across the world. So we do have, the basic normative framework that protects expression online. But we've seen countries, go beyond those. And then later on, I'll just demonstrate the reason why the internet really shouldn't be turned off. But before I go to that, so I must state that freedom of expression, basically online and offline, is not absolute. There must be some parameters within which we must express ourselves even online. So that means that, countries within Africa or across the world may have a leeway to, sort of turn off the internet, but under what parameter, do these countries turn off the internet? So under Article 19.3 of the Iccpr, we have, limitations, acceptable limitations for the enjoyment of the right to express and communicate online, including on, and this, is for the respect of the rights or reputation of others. And that framework really, establishes what we call the three-part test. And within the three-part test, the restrictions must be within the law. And we already saw that the African Commission stated that, within the law is international standards and best practices. States must ensure that, such restrictions are accessible and formulated with sufficient precision. So it's not enough for you to enact the law, but they must be, precise and not vague. However, we see most of the laws across Africa that sort of guide, communication online are vague. That's why in Uganda, the Uganda Communications Commission said we're shutting down the internet under sections 5.1 and 56. which say, you can deny access for justifiable causes, but they didn't explain what the justifiable causes are. So that ambiguity is not accepted within the international normative framework, of expression. Thirdly, such limitations must be necessary and, in a democratic society. And, they must be proportional. So does an internet shutdown, is an internet shutdown proportional to what the government or the state is alleging? Uganda, for example, like many other countries in Africa, is bound by Article 9 of the African Charter, and the normative frameworks on internet, on freedom of expression. But we see, like my colleague John said, over and over, the government coming out to apply the standards in excessive manner. So we see a regulatory overreach by the broadcasting or the regulatory bodies that are supposed to oversee internet. I'd like to bring your attention to what we call the Syracusa principles on the limitation and derogation of provisions in the Iccpr. So much as the Iccpr under Article 19.3 provides for limitations within which to enjoy expression, it goes ahead and puts in place the Syracusa principles, where states, have the burden to justify a limitation upon a right that is guaranteed, and they must demonstrate that that limitation does not impair the democratic functioning of a society. So these principles do recognize that there's no, single mode of a democratic society. However, a society which recognizes, the basic human rights standards across the world fall under democratic society, which I think Uganda is. We're party to the Iccpr and Article 9. For a state to invoke national security, as it did in Uganda before internet shutdowns, it must really justify the measures limiting certain rights only when they are, taken to protect the existence of the nation or, our territorial integrity or political independence, and that wasn't the case. So these principles demonstrate that national security cannot be invoked as a reason for imposing limitations to prevent mere local or relatively isolated threats to law and order, which we saw, people coming out to threaten that they will demonstrate, rightly so, because they have the right under the Constitution, and then the government goes on to shut down the internet. So that's not acceptable. Where there's a systematic violation of human rights, undermining true national security, the government cannot come out, to say we're shutting down internet because we're protecting national security, and yet, there's blatant abuse of rights. And, if you read other jurisprudence from other countries, they say, that that any claims of public interest immunity must be objectively verified and justified on grounds that is dangerous for a court of law to grant any public interest immunity privilege on the basis of subjective fears alone. So what we saw in Uganda was subjective fears, and we can refer to that as prior restraint. The deactivation of the internet here foreclosed any sort of possibility of communication even before it was expressed. So that shutdown, we can say, was prior restraint of speech, and courts across the world have referred to that as one of the most serious and least tolerable infringements to freedom of expression. And it's important, as the African Union has stated, that access to information and expression during elections is very important. When you read the Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa that were passed in 2019, it calls on states to ensure that the public receives adequate and politically balanced information, particularly during election periods. And it also encourages states to promote private media and vehicles for the development and dissemination of information in the public interest. John really explained how the media was gagged during these elections, especially after the internet was shut down. The public was cut off from receiving information. Finally, when you read the 2017 guidelines, African Union Commission guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa, they sort of provide direction on access to information in election seasons, and call on stakeholders to proactively provide information during elections, because the commission really thinks that if you keep the people in the dark, there'll be unease, and this breeds distrust, lack of confidence. We'll see civil tensions and conflicts arising, as we've seen in other countries. And the guidelines clearly stipulate that for elections to be free and fair and credible, the electorate must have access to information at all stages of the electoral process, and failure to provide that access during and after elections makes it really impossible for citizens to meaningfully exercise their right to vote and to participate in the elections. I think I'll stop there for now.
So just a quick follow-up on my side, Catherine. Would you say that under the African human rights system, there is a clear, express right for individuals to access the internet?
Yes, definitely. And under the 2017 guidelines, the Commission says the media and internet regulatory bodies are directed, to adopt regulations on media coverage during elections, and the state cannot turn off internet without justifiable reasons. So what we see many countries doing, switching on and off internet without justifiable
hello, Catherine.
reasons.
It seems like
because
it's
we all live in a dictatorial who have overstayed their welcome. Well, yes, so we are talking about internet shutdowns, and we still are experiencing internet throttling in Uganda. So I think this talk is actually timely because as you know,
They don't want your ideas to get out, Catherine. It looks like we're having some technical difficulties. We'll link back with Catherine in a moment. But the gist of her presentation was that although no freedom is absolute, any limitation on the right to digital expression needs to be necessary and proportionate. Let's move now to Ichumile. My question to you is a bit more complicated. Last year,
internet has been very slow. We got days without, properly accessing. Our government has gone beyond the standards.
Hello. Apologies, Catherine. I think we'll come back to you in a moment, just to give you some time, your connection, some time to recover. So last year, after that fatal invasion on the US Capitol building, Twitter decided to suspend US President Donald Trump's account, even though he was the sitting head of the state at that time. Do you think that in the future, there's a real risk that politically motivated restrictions, like Twitter's in relation to Trump, could create a practice of social media blacklisting here in Africa?
So thanks, Thomas, and I hope I'm audible. Do you mind just repeating your question, because I missed it as my colleague Catherine was coming in and out?
Sure thing. I was making reference to the US Capitol invasion and the decision by Twitter to permanently suspend the account of President Donald Trump. I wanted to ask, now, if Trump is the president of the US and Twitter has no trouble suspending his account, what do you think the ramifications could be for freedom of expression here in Africa, where we also have leaders that are not shy to say things that are perhaps not the most appropriate, but over and above that, in relation to political activists, when there is a situation where you have African social media platforms, homegrown, there are none yet, but in that hypothetical, how do you think we'd have to deal with that problem?
Sure. So I think partly to answer your question, and thank you for it, it is slightly more complex. We do need to look at the role of big tech in democracy and in elections in a much more kind of narrow way. And for me, we're not having enough of a nuanced conversation around the role of big tech in democracy. And here you just need to think of Cambridge Analytica. There's nothing private anymore in terms of our lives, and untold billions are being made from data mining and the attendant kind of data capitalism, etc. Google knows everything about us, right? They know where I ate last night. They know where my daughter goes to school. They know what restaurants I like to frequent. They know that I love to search for expensive Christian Dior bags that I can't afford on a civil society salary. So there is no secrecy anymore. And I think we have to be having a much more deliberate conversation about the evils that come with big tech, because not all of it is good. A lot of it is good, and internet and big tech has become an equalizer when it comes to expression, access to information, association, freedom of association, and all of the beautiful constitutionally enshrined freedoms that we should be experiencing. But there's another side to it, and I think the other side to it is what you've touched on what Twitter did with President Trump's account. And there was a debate raging at the time, and that debate was that, where do you draw the line between freedom of expression and when that freedom of expression directly has an impact on the freedoms that others enjoy? And I don't think it's a debate that's been resolved as yet. And those are kind of the nuances that we have to be infusing into our conversations. And it's clear that data, internet, tech has been instrumentalized by dictators, by autocrats, by would-be dictators in order to sustain their own stranglehold on power. But at the same time, that very same data and internet is what's allowing us as citizens to express ourselves at times when we can't be gathering in the streets. So I think there's a balance that we have to look at. I do think that there's a possibility that much more similar actions will be seen as regards accounts being suspended. I think there's a vibrant engagement happening at the level of civil society globally, countering, disinformation, like we saw with Trump, like we've seen in many other places, and countering anti-democratic measures that are aimed to throttle any kind of civic activism. And so actions related to countering that, including suspensions of accounts, will be seen much more in future. But on the other hand, these big data companies are capitalists, right? They make money from this kind of engagement. You only need to look at the hashtags that follow disinformation to understand the level of interaction that disinformation and misinformation elicit. And that's money to be made, whatever way you look at it. And so the question that becomes, what are we as civil society doing to hold these actors to account, who sometimes make money from democratic regression, from autocracy? And what is our role in continuing the activism while also recognizing that these platforms are very much good for promoting and advancing democracy? So maybe let me end it there for now, and we'll take it forward a bit later. Thank you.
Right, and that's actually leads us right into the broader debate I want us to have. But before we start, I just want to make sure, Catherine, are you with us?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Right. Yes, we can. I think perhaps it's advisable then that you don't turn on your camera, just that you restrict the amount of bandwidth that you're using.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for that last contribution. And I think it's essential because much of our debates in civil society is to treat the internet as though it is benign. There's almost the assumption that more internet means an improvement in democracy, almost automatically. And I don't think that there's been any serious engagement with that reality. And when you look at some of the global developments, I also think they point in a different direction. Like the internet is damaging democracy in the United States today. The internet is damaging democracy in Eastern Europe. And at the same time, it is enhancing authoritarianism in China, a state which has major political and economic influence, apologies, on the African continent. So I think that we need to ask ourselves in real terms, how do we manage the internet so that it enhances African democracies as opposed to jeopardizing them? And I want to open the floor up now to all of our panelists. We'll start with you, Johnson. And then this section of the presentation is going to be very fluid, so feel free to jump in at any time. Hello, Johnson. It appears that we've lost him, I think. Ah, okay, perfect. So your views on that?
I request you to come up with the question again. Just apologies.
No, not a problem. So really what we're trying to understand is the internet really this neutral tool? Or are there some pernicious effects that broad access to the internet might have that might damage democracy? So in as much as the webinar's topic is, are internet shutdowns good for democracy? That question seems to presuppose that the internet itself is automatically good for democracy. And that's not something that I think has been proven. And I'm hoping we can explore this a bit in this debate.
Thank you, Thomas. I would say it's a two-double-edged sword. It enhances democracy in a way that it facilitates flow of information and provides platform for expression and participation of citizenry to make informed decisions. When it comes to the other side where it jeopardizes democracy, I believe if there should be limitations or any concerns as to why internet should be limited or should be shut or should be made inaccessible to citizens, like Kathy has pointed out, it should be provided for under the law, like the threefold steps that should be taken. Yes, much as the citizenry take part in participation and active expression, it is upon, I can say it's upon now the media to provide credible information such that the information that is being provided is not misinformation, does not distort the facts. It's now the role of the media to come out and fact check and debunk any misinformation that could be used in the misuse of the internet. So in a democratic society, yes, it's important to have the internet because it allows free flow of information. We're on the side where it enhances authoritarian regimes to abuse human rights, I believe it can be used in a way that governments and all those stakeholders that are involved in the abuse can be brought to book and follow up all those that are involved in the misuse of the internet. Thank you.
So, Catherine, on your side, how would you propose that we address that problem?
Thank you, Thomas. For me, I think the good outweighs the bad. So with the technological advancements, internet becomes a very vital tool, you know, not just for democracy, but for a way of life for many people, education, health, and so many other related rights. And you know, interestingly, the very first resolution that was passed by the UN in 1946, what you know, touched on information, and it stated that you know, freedom of information is a fundamental human right, and the touchstone of all the freedoms to which the United Nations is consecrated. So that means, you know, states must facilitate in any means ways in which, you know, citizens must access information on all media. And right now, the internet is the easiest way on which, you know, to reach a mass of people. John spoke about, you know, the double-edged sword. And many countries we see, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, have legislated, you know, passed fake news and disinformation laws to sort of curb disinformation online. And for me, fake news and disinformation legislation, I think, are one of, currently pose one of the biggest threats to freedom of expression, access to information and media freedom. Because when you read all these laws in South Africa and Zimbabwe, they have imprecise definitions and have largely been misinterpreted and abused by authoritarian governments. Many journalists, and other critical voices have faced criminal charges while reporting the pandemic and elections and, other public interest stories that are mostly touching public officials and institutions. And this has really led to unnecessary gagging and online censorship, and in a sense denied the public their right to know. For me, the restrictions on the use of internet through these many laws are inimical to democracy and serve no legitimate purpose besides stifling dissent and debate and punishing valid criticism. So fake news and disinformation, for example, should never be criminalized, as any such laws have no place in a democratic society, because the guaranteed freedom of expression does not only extend to information that is perceived as true, but also untrue statements, unless such falsities, incite hatred and discrimination or hostility or hate speech. Instead, states should promote independent media, like John stated, through providing enabling environments to professionalize rather than using, ambiguous laws to sort of gag access to information and expression online.
Ms. Gqada, your views on the topic?
Thanks so much, colleagues, and really, really excited to be talking about this. So I can't dispute at all what Catherine said initially around there's been much more good than there has been harm. Of course, we can debate this, but my view is that certainly if you look at the catalytic effect that tech and data and the internet have on citizen mobilization, activism, solidarity beyond national borders, then it becomes quite easy to see the real tangible good that's come out of the age of the internet. And I think recently, just to name a few examples that all of us will be aware of, we saw a global outpouring of support for Bobi Wine that the colleagues on the panel have spoken about, and the attacks that he and his family as well as supporters endured from the state. Huge outpouring. We were directly reaching out to Cyril Ramaphosa in his role as AU chair, and we're directly reaching out to other bilateral donors of Uganda, including the US, to demand some kind of accountability. And I don't think that we can undermine that international activism and just spirit of togetherness that rose out of online engagements. And of course, we can't forget the solidarity that came out of the Sudan revolution, in Nigeria, the End SARS campaign, Black Lives Matter, I Can't Breathe, the Tigray almost civil war, if we're comfortable to call it that, as well as much more recently the protests in Senegal that are now happening still after the arrest of the opposition leader Sonko. And I think all of these examples demonstrate very compellingly the power of the internet in how it assists us to, or perhaps facilitates our activism in terms of defending our hard-won democratic freedoms, as well as advancing the common good, right? Yet, of course, as colleagues have mentioned, and as you've mentioned, Thomas, internet is very much weaponized by those whom we are advocating against and by those whose actions directly undermine our own freedoms. And I think the fact that the very tool that presents such opportunity is the exact same tool that can be used against us just shows you how insidious and how far autocrats are willing to go in order to maintain their positions of power. And it's also clear to me, at least, that while a lot of reasons are given for internet shutdowns, some of them maybe you can try and understand, okay, national security, however vague that is, but sometimes there is a veneer of legitimacy that makes it difficult to really argue compellingly against them. But a lot of the time, it's blatantly that rulers actually are hiding human rights violations during key political moments. And really, to take you back to Zimbabwe in 2019 January, when there were massive protests, and colleagues will know how difficult it is to get citizens in Zim to actually stage those national massive protests that are happening everywhere. This happened in January 2019 after an economic shock, which is a usual driver for protests. And immediately what ZANU-PF did, and I say ZANU-PF because ZANU-PF, the state and the military are one thing in Zimbabwe. What ZANU-PF did was then to say, okay, how do we drive these people back to their rural homes where they cannot be seen in the street, where they're not stimulating other protests, and where we can control how citizens are showing up. Literally shut down the internet, because that's where people are engaging. That's where people are calling one another to action. And we're also seeing, we also saw in Ethiopia last year, middle of last year, when one of the popular musicians from Oroma was killed, huge, massive protests, almost unseen. And again, what happens? 2-week internet shutdown, go back into your huts, or your homes, your 3-bedroom houses, or wherever the case may be, and don't be in the streets, because we're not going to tolerate any kind of action in the direction of pushing for democracy. Maybe the last thing I'm going to say in this segment, before I'm accused of speaking beyond the question, is we also need to talk about the unintended consequences of the shutdowns. So the intended consequence is to suppress activism, to silence, and to marginalize. That's quite obvious. But actually, these rulers have now started to realize that the unintended consequences, the direct undermining of socioeconomic rights, whether you're looking at how some citizens access health services using mobile telephony or the internet because they're located too far from clinics, so medical advice comes through WhatsApp, or whether you're looking at transactions, so we now buy goods and services online. There's mobile money. In most of our countries, we've really moved from a lot from physical to online purchases. And this is not a class thing. It's all kinds of classes that are engaging in this kind of e-commerce. And the minute you shut down the internet, it affects livelihoods, right? What happens when Emmerson Mnangagwa decides that the hashtag ZANU-PF must fall has attracted too much attention? He shuts down the internet. What happens when election time is coming up and Museveni decides that actually he wants to rule Uganda for another 20 years? He shuts down the internet. And this has a direct impact on lives and livelihoods. And lives are lost. People die. Look at COVID and the information around mitigation measures that we constantly need to be accessing. And a lot of this access is online. What happens when people don't have access to this information? People die. And so I think we also need to be adding that kind of strand to the conversation. Thanks, I'll stop there for now.
That's crucial. And to make it clear, absolutely nobody will be accused of over speaking past the question. So one of the points that you touched on, specifically in relation to the matter of Zimbabwe, was how all the state's agencies represent ZANU-PF, and whatever ZANU-PF's will is will be affected, and that will result in internet shutdowns. But I wonder if there's another actor that we are also missing, and you did touch on it earlier, the concept of big data. To what extent are internet service providers, for example, in the case like Zimbabwe, where MTN had eliminated communication on its network, to what extent are these internet service providers complicit in the internet shutdowns that are pervasive on the continent? That question is.
I'm assuming to me? Oh, okay.
But no, you can go ahead and take it, and then we'll hear from the other two.
Okay, sure. So maybe I'll be quite brief so that my other colleagues, panelists can come in. So certainly ISPs are completely complicit in this behavior. It's virtually impossible to shut down the internet just for the government alone to shut down the internet. The ISPs own the spectrum. They control whether the light switches on or switches off, to put it very simplistically. And I do think that a lot of the activism and advocacy that we undertake has to necessarily move beyond government to private sector. And it's easy for us to target government for a number of reasons. government is who we elect, supposedly. Most of the time we don't, they elect themselves, but governments are who we elect in order to represent the common good. They are the vanguards of democracy. They are responsible for advancing the common good, development, livelihoods, etc. They're the ones that we pay our taxes to in order for them to then remobilize those taxes to development and to easing kind of our existence in a way. So certainly they should be the first port of call when it comes to transparency and accountability demands. But governments don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in an ecosystem where they are enabled, especially when we talk about autocrats. Autocrats are funded, they're enabled, and autocracy is facilitated by a number of players that we can talk about a bit later on, whether it's foreign actors, whether it's geopolitical considerations, whether it's local political elites, but there's a complex network of power brokers that make sure they act in the interest of incumbents and in the interest of autocracy. And so I think that's the one point. The second point related to that is when it comes to private sector accountability, I think the framing, and you guys obviously have this conversation all the time. So for the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about internet service providers, but the framing does need to be far broader than that, because the ISPs are but one little teeny weeny actor in a huge array of private sector interests who in the shadows dictate policy, who drive the development agenda, who manipulate elections or assist politicians to manipulate elections, and who work in order to keep funding the system. So patronage and clientelism comes from money. Money comes from the private sector. Governments are not positioned to make money in and of themselves. And that relationship and that nexus is, for me, the most insidious, most dangerous, most dangerous kind of entity in terms of supporting and maintaining democracy. So certainly private interests need to have a lot more attention from us than is currently the case. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Johnson, you've turned your mic on. Your view on that?
Thank you, Thomas. I'll agree with the previous speaker. The private sectors and the service providers are complicit in a way that much as we are talking about the roles and the responsibility they have towards the citizenry, we must also have it in mind that some of these, like the previous speaker has spoken, they play in the interests of the government, because if the government says they are not working in the country, they may not continue working. So it's sometimes some of the actions that they take are out of fear. They are pressured into doing what they do. And this emanates mainly from the legal system that exists in such governments. So if we are to go against such actions or to address such issues, and maybe we should also focus on strategic advocacy and litigation, and to see that the laws are adjusted and amended in accordance to what represents the interests of the population, so that the companies can also be held accountable by the citizens and those that they provide services to. Thank you.
So, Catherine, what I want to ask you is, definitely one of the ways to address this problem is by developing elaborate legal frameworks for the authorization of internet shutdowns. But for example, in a state like Zimbabwe or Uganda, for example, where where there might be a legislative process, but really anything that the man in charge wants goes, is that even realistic? That's the first question. The second question that I want to ask you is, at the regional level, you've made reference to the general principles, the African Charter itself, and the rights contained there. But when Museveni decides to turn off the lights, does he stop and consider, what does the AU instrument say on this particular matter? Is that at all a meaningful consideration for these leaders?
Thank you, Thomas. I think, that is a sort of rhetorical question, especially in Africa, where the more individuals hold on to power, the more powerful they become. and this power is often turned into authoritarianism, where, instead of the rule of law, we see either rule regardless of the law or rule by law. And rule by law means, the states come up with laws, but these laws are illegitimate. They do not meet what we call the three-part tests. They don't meet the regional and international standards. So these authorities normally usurp, powers of the independent bodies, and interfere into other arms of government, like the judiciary that is supposed to oversee the legislature that enacts these laws. For example, we've seen in Uganda where MPs vote to rubber stamp the ruling party's position, for, say, from 7 to rule, for forever. We saw that they were paid to do that. Not that they may not believe that he should rule, but because, the majority of members of parliament are from the ruling party and they're being paid to rubber stamp a position, they'll do so despite the harm that may cause. When these institutions have been illegitimized, by the ruling parties, who are despots, we say they have ruled forever, then that means there won't be any rule of law. So parliament cannot come up with progressive laws when the executive arm of government is quite dictatorial. When civil society has been disarmed, lawyers are arrested, as we saw in Uganda, and on flimsy charges of money laundering. So we cannot sort of see a progression of standards and policies and laws, that sort of facilitate expression, media rights, if the government that is sitting is looking to sort of cement their stay. So until there's an overhaul of the system, that's when we'll see that these regional standards that have been put in place by the African Commission, the AU, the international standards, and very interestingly, most of these democratic countries are always very quick to sign and ratify international standards and regional standards, but in terms of execution, they limp. And someone like Museveni, he's held in high regards within the African system, the AU. So and he's gotten away with a lot of ills, a lot of and during these elections, how many times have you seen the African Union come out to detest the way the elections were handled, or the battering of journalists? Journalists were beaten at the UN Human Rights Office. We didn't see the African Union coming out, to say to call out the state on that. So I think the AU has also sat back and watched different states on the continent retrogress and impede on the standards that they have set, which really defeats the whole objective of setting these standards. So like I said, we just need a total overhaul. Probably in the next decade, we might see more progressive leaders who want to put these standards, who want to respect these standards the way they should be respected, who want to respect institutions that protect these standards, legislature that puts in place the laws, the judiciary that adjudicates. You spoke about big data and ISPs. I mean, not that they don't understand the law, but these are orders from above, and there's no way to challenge an order from above if you're feeding from it. So they'll turn off the internet because they have told them to turn off, not that they don't know the laws that should be followed before turning off the internet.
So certainly waiting.
Can I come in?
Question.
Yes, sure. And then after that, I would like to address a few of our viewers' questions, but please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I've got a tendency to just barge in. So I have a bit of a discomfort with what's sounding like we're saying the ISPs have no choice. They've been told to shut down because otherwise the feeding trough will no longer be a feeding trough. And it almost sounds to me as if, I mean, it's reminiscent to me of the Nazi soldiers that said, I was just following orders, you know, and also kind of makes me think of mining companies that come into our countries. They buy land from government or from a private actor, and the government doesn't have proper resettlement laws, you know, and compensation laws. And the private company says, well, you know, we're booting you off the land and there's no obligation arising to us because there's no law that actually says that we need to compensate you for the next 50 years of your life. And for me, I think that we need to hold these guys to a much higher standard. They parade as though they've got ethical policies. They parade as though human rights are central to their activities and that they don't, you know, consider bottom line above everything else. And if this is how they show up in our continent and in our countries, then certainly civil society should be holding them to that standard, no matter the orders that they get from above, which make sure that they stay in business. Which is a huge issue for me, I think. Secondly, related to that, ethical leadership is something that we really need to be working towards on the continent. And this is public leadership, but also private sector leadership. And I think we need to get to a point where companies, where we support companies that we see are willing to say goodbye if human rights are not observed and not respected, and companies that are willing to say not in my name. And I think related to this as well is that part of our advocacy needs to make sure that human rights and constitutional entrenched rights are infused into IT policies, whether it's IT policies of these companies or of governments themselves. And I think if we start to frame it a little bit this way and say, no compromise, guys, no compromise, human rights are preeminent, then we'll get some way. Thanks.
Do you really think that's, and I see you turned your mic on, Johnson. We'll be with you in a moment. I just want to ask, is that really entirely practical? So, for example, MTN, let's say MTN is the only broadcaster in an African country. It's the only broadcaster in Nigeria. And they are instructed, not that Nigeria has too great a problem with internet shutdowns, but still, they're instructed to turn down the internet. And then we say, MTN says, not in my name, forever. Does that not frustrate the other kinds of engagements that would occur in supposedly peacetime, in situations where the debate is not as contentious? What's your view on that?
So I think the real test to whether an individual or a company respects human rights only comes during difficult times. It only comes during those political moments where pressure is placed and a decision has to be made between ethics and bottom line and finance. And I think the only way to know is testing it. And one of the ways I feel as citizens that we could express our views is not just to get onto Twitter and to say hashtag MTN must fall. Delist, cancel your MTN SIM card and move to another service provider. That's where you hit the bottom line. But it's not going to help with just Ichumile removing her subscription to MTN. It has to be a critical mass in order for us to see change. And maybe a quick unrelated example is that I was on Twitter a few days ago, and there was a protest in Latin America. I'm not sure, I think it was Brazil. It was trending. And one of the comments that were making the rounds was that, we'll never see this in South Africa. People are too busy doing their own thing. And my view of it was, all of the struggles that we're seeing in South Africa are fundamentally trying to trying to push for democracy. Whether you look at marginalized women, whether you look at LGBTI, whether you look at rural women who don't have access to livelihoods, whether you look at state capture, all of that are different parts of one call that says respect us and respect our democracy and respect our open society. And I think coming together in our protests and understanding that everything is interrelated helps us bring the message across and help solidarity, which is why I'm saying it can't just be me. It has to be all of us together. Thanks.
And I see you're getting a lot of endorsement on that point on the chat box. Johnson, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Thomas. I would agree with Ichumile about holding these service providers accountable to the people they provide services to. But what we are talking about here is African system where most leaders, like she earlier hinted on, like there are many power deals that are cut, and most of these companies that come into these countries aiming at making profits and aiming at making money. Their major aim is to make money. So when it comes to issues that would threaten their business in a particular environment, they would rather side with that, with the side that they feel more comfortable or that will enable their running of business continuity. Maybe what we can do, like it was earlier hinted on, is maybe informing the citizenry, ensuring that they are informed to demand their rights. Once that is done, I believe it can stem from the citizenry, it can stem from the people that consume these services. If we demand, say, a boycott from those that are receiving services, maybe these companies can be responsive in respecting their rights. But if that is not happening and it's just the government that is having an upper hand into what kind of business they conduct in these particular countries, I think we still have a long way to achieve that. If we have to say, okay, let's, if it would be harder for these companies to say we are closing business because the government doesn't want us to act in a particular way. So it stems back into having an active citizenry and enabling them know their rights so that they can demand them equally from the government and also private sector. Thank you.
So Mela's question relates directly to this topic. They're asking, what can civil society do to more effectively address this problem? And now the one proposal that's very popular is the matter of boycotts. Are there any other forms of activism that we can also explore? Catherine, on your side.
Yes, definitely. So for example, in Uganda, we've used the court system, including, to bring these ISPs to book. For example, in 2013, during the SIM card registration process, ISPs, MTN, Orange, Airtel, they were basically flouting the law while doing registration. Instead of registering for SIM cards, they were registering for mobile money until we went to court. I led a number of, other civil society, and we challenged this in court. And much as the court agreed with us, the court said, the process was moot because registration had ended and registration can never end. So civil society normally, does a lot in terms of educating the public, and what that case did was to bring to the fore, the registration process, what citizens need to know, what right forms they need to fill. Much as we didn't get a decision in our favor, well, the court agreed that the ISPs were flouting the process. But they ruled that, the decision is basically moot because the date that the state had set for registration had ended. But in that sense, citizens now knew that, they had to re-register with the right form under the law and not the forms that the ISPs had created. Just to follow up with what Ichumile was saying, we do as civil society often hold these ISPs to account, but in a system, in a political dispensation where it's all convoluted with restrictive practices, by the time you go to court, you're going to get a moot judgment, and court process is not cheap. So much as we have to keep bringing these issues to the fore, we also need to rethink the strategies, especially in countries like ours, where we're moving from dictatorship to authoritarianism, and where the state is sitting in and they'll do whatever it takes for them to stay in power, even if it means gagging every single person that comes their way. So we need to look into other countries, how they've come up with new strategies to sort of hold the powers that be to account without loss of lives. We've seen in Uganda so many people are losing lives just by coming out, to say that the government is doing wrong. They're arrested and never seen. So we just need to step back and rethink what can work best in such a situation, beyond courts, beyond advocacy. If journalists can be beaten at the UN Human Rights Office, really, what kind of state are we degenerating to? And we want to look to more progressive states like South Africa that have been in this situation and progressed. What is the way forward for us?
Leila Ahmed has asked whether or not there's been a referral by the African Commission of a case concerning internet shutdowns to the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Is anyone aware of such a case? I know that there is a talk of a form of strategic litigation on that issue, Leila, in the Center for Human Rights. But Catherine, by any chance, have you considered approaching one of the regional bodies to make some of these claims?
So the East African Court already has, the East African Court really has already received a case from the East African Lawyers Association challenging the internet shutdown in Uganda. The only other case that I know is the Togo case, where Amnesty challenged, the internet shutdown in Togo, and it was held to be in violation of human rights. But I don't know any case that has come to the African courts, to challenge internet shutdowns. Maybe Tanzania. I'll have to follow up if my colleagues in Tanzania have filed a case to that effect. But to the best of my knowledge, I know there's one in the East African Court now, and then the ECOWAS Court, which already ruled on the Togo case.
Right. And then any other final steps that we think that civil society can take to address this problem?
So can I come in?
Certainly.
Okay, thanks. So I think totally echo what the colleagues have said. I do think that there's one more area that probably hasn't been mentioned as far as I could hear, and that's on shareholder activism. So when I used to work in the mining industry, this is something that we really spent a lot of time on. And the industries are completely different, of course, but the impact on human rights is what's comparable here. And how we went about it was to say, okay, mining company X comes into Mozambique, rides roughshod over all kinds of rights because they can. The government is in cahoots with them, or the government is weak and can't address the issues and protect or sanction them again for the human rights violations. So where else can we be looking? They're headquartered in Australia or the UK, and there it's much more unpalatable to be killing people, maiming people, silencing journalists. And so approach them where it hurts most and do the activism at that level. And some of these ISPs that we're talking about are also, prone to the same kind of pressure. And so we should be looking at South Africa for MTN, whatever the case is, or this place for that company, as long as where the shareholders are, where the company is headquartered, we think that there's much more reaction we can get for those violations. So I think that's something that we could be adapting from the mining scenario. Then I think also, in my mind, there are cases where there's little that can be done locally, like the Uganda case, where the state is the military and the military is the arm to effect whatever the executive says. And there we could be looking at alternatives like we do here in Southern Africa, where community radio is an excellent alternative means for access to information and promoting citizen expression. And I know contexts are different, but in our region particularly, community radio is high up there in terms of access to information. And a lot of citizens in this region are still residing in rural areas. And this is where community radio operates most. And linked to that is community journalism. So training journalists, reporters located in rural and peri-urban areas to do their own investigations and reportage is also an alternative where direct confrontation with the state and ISPs is much more of a challenge than in other areas. And there are examples here that we can talk about later on. At least we've been supporting as OSISA a lot of entities that operate at this level. Thank you.
Right. I just want to return to this issue of the problem of election interference. And Ichumile, you also brought it up when you started, when you'd spoken about Cambridge Analytica and its effects on the US elections. But actually, before Cambridge Analytica made headlines for its involvement in election interference in the US and in Brexit, it had actually been active in Kenya, influencing elections there. Interestingly enough, one of Cambridge Analytica's first clients was the African National Congress here in South Africa back in 1994. The ANC had wanted to assess the political landscape in South Africa, and as a data science company, Cambridge Analytica helped really lay that landscape for the party. I want to ask, what are some of the concerns that we have in relation to foreign election interference, firstly, and then also domestic election interference, taking advantage of the broad access to information that the internet provides? Not everyone at once.
Sorry, can you repeat it? I just lost you there for a second.
Oh, so really the question is, where do we stand on this matter of election interference? Yeah, we're just looking for perspectives on that point.
Shall I
So specifically, the risks involved, how access to the internet also creates greater risks for foreign election interference, not unlike Russian interference with the US election. And if it's easy for states with a large IT machinery to interfere with elections in a superpower like the United States, it should be far more easier for them to interfere with elections here in Africa.
I mean, maybe just a perspective from my end. I'm not quite sure, and I think I need to do a little bit more thinking on this. I'm not quite sure my experience suggests that big data is used in Africa or in Southern Africa in the way and to the extent that it's used in developed countries. My experience of internet has been much more in the direction of disinformation, in the direction of shaping certain narratives that fit the incumbent and the incumbent's victory, rather than the Cambridge Analytica type interference. So I would find it a little bit difficult to answer that question as directly as you've posed it.
I think the specific direction in which I'm moving in is, for example, Cambridge Analytica was involved in the disinformation that related to the US case was premised upon Cambridge Analytica's assessment of people's prejudices. So that's the direction which I'm going, that taking advantage of the benefits of big data, there is a risk, and the increased risk in Africa, that private sector companies are capable of evaluating prejudices on the continent and exploiting those prejudices, not only just in favor of an incumbent, but also for any political actor that's prepared to foot the bill. And how do we see those risks playing out in future elections in Africa? And I do believe that, like you had said, disinformation is already an increasing factor in elections on the continent.
Okay, so just a minute from me then. I do think that this is going to be a far bigger problem going forward. And you just need to look at South Africa and the Gupta disinformation, radical economic transformation campaign in order to see the power of this platform in order to direct political conversations. And here, in my view, exactly what you're explaining happened. There was a mining of people's data, understanding people's preferences, understanding where they are likely to fall on the spectrum of radical economic transformation versus, I don't know, democracy or whatever, and deliberately targeting them using bots, using language, using certain leaders in order to drive a campaign that says the Guptas equal radical economic transformation, and if you're against RET, then it means you're against Black progress. And how polarized that conversation became was so dangerous for South Africa's democracy. And it just showed us in such a big way that language and internet combined really have a lot of power to destroy democracy. So maybe that's what I'll offer for now. And just to summarize that, I think it's going to be a major issue going forward. Thanks.
Johnson, as a journalist, I'm sure you've also encountered your fair share of disinformation. What have you observed in Uganda?
From my observation, concerning the question, right? Hello?
Hello, Johnson?
Yes, please.
Please go ahead.
From the observation, going forward, it's going to be something that is of interest to democracies, as also in Uganda as well, because through it, the electorate can be influenced to vote a particular leadership in the country, and in the end, it might be the desired leadership that is needed for that particular moment. So, from the journalist point of view, I believe is something that is of course and that we should pay attention to.
Catherine?
Thomas, something interesting that came up a few days ago, where our president, came out and said Bobby Wine and his group cheated massively in the elections, but still lost. And he won. He's just waiting to be sworn in, and that was laughable. So looking back at the periods of elections where Facebook came out and, shut off over 50 accounts of the ruling party, saying, they were engaged in disinformation and, tampering with information in the election. And then the president got very angry. We saw 2 days later that social media was shut off. Up to now, Facebook, we don't have Facebook in Uganda unless you're using a VPN. In my view, for a state where leaders have stayed in power for over 30 years, it's very hard. I mean, they have all the resources. So if there's any disinformation that's going to arise massively within elections, it's going to be perpetrated by the ruling party. I don't think that oppositions that are always gagged can have the power, to come up with campaigns, disinformation campaigns that may jeopardize the elections, like in Uganda, because then what do? Shut off the internet. So we're already cutting off their clipping off their wings. So even if they intend to do any disinformation, the ruling party is not going to allow them because they won't have the platform to do so. So in more dictatorial countries, I think it's a very steep hill to climb. And I think the ruling government still takes it when it comes to disinformation during elections.
Right. So
they have all the resources really to pay even foreigners, to engage in disinformation during elections.
Right, and I think that's a very good place to leave it. What we'll do now is we'll have closing remarks from each of our speakers. We started with you, Johnson, so let's end with you. Lead us out quickly.
Thank you. My closing remarks should be that, yes, internet shutdown is growing each and every year that comes. Most African states and dictatorial regimes are adopting new ways and new methods of stifling freedom of expression and access to information. What we need to do as moving forward is, as we have already alluded to, is having strategic litigation and advocacy and mechanisms in place to ensure that these governments are brought to book to account for whatever that actions that they take in limiting the information access and freedom of expression. I also think we should build coalitions among our civil society organizations, learning from experiences of those that have done well, and also implementing them back into our own communities and countries to ensure that we succeed in pushing back against such authoritative actions of the current regimes. I would also think advocacy, and as the media, I believe we play a big role in providing the information to the public and informing them and enabling them make informed decisions. I think it's another area that we need to focus on in providing credible information. Even in hard times, I believe we can still maneuver around in ways that we can. With those that we can't, then we have to push back and find ways that we can mitigate through litigation and advocacy to ensure that there's really an environment that enables free media to enable the citizens be informed, to make informed decisions and push back against all authoritative or bad actions of the governments. Thank you.
Catherine, from your side?
Yeah, so Thomas, I think we all need to go back to the basics. What's the role of, non-state actors, civil society, the media, in contributing to democratization of their countries? And for example, in Uganda, we've had a harsh history before this government came in, and everyone was happy with the government, with Museveni's government when it came in, because there was quite a bit of violence before that. And when the constitution was being set up, the commission that set it up went to the people and asked them, what should we do? How do you want the constitution to look like? And there was sort of consensus that's in promotion of nation building. The individual should be looked at or should be taken as the basic unit who should be entitled to basic human rights. I think we've forgotten that. And then, the commission and the people say that effective operation of basic human rights entails the establishment of autonomous and coherent civic organizations through which citizens can articulate their interests through legal structures and the mass media. And it has been past violations of the basic human rights that has undermined our nation building processes. And we're seeing those coming back now. But there's a general agreement that autonomous civil society organizations and a free press are some of the basic conditions, for promotion of human rights and nation building. And if we go back to those basics, then we can cohesively start to rebuild our societies, our countries, to reignite the respect of rule of law, human rights, and democracy, not just within the citizens, but the institutions that are supposed to uphold those rights and freedoms. Thank you.
And then closing us off is Ichumile.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this discussion and engagement. I was just reading some of the chats and I saw one of the participants has suggested that prejudices would exist even without the Cambridge Analyticas of the world. And I think I chuckled a bit because that's so true. Prejudices were there before the internet and they'll be there certainly in a world long after the internet. But I think what is important is that we counter how these prejudices have been instrumentalized for myopic gain and to maintain the power of some over others, as well as to silence some and not others. So I think that's just a quick reflection on that comment. So I think several thoughts maybe I have. Maybe number one is the alternatives that I tried to speak about earlier around community media, community journalism, and much more localized information sharing platforms and mechanisms that can still sustain even in a context of of a shutdown, and at least reach however few people compared to the national level engagement. So those are real alternatives that are being supported and initiated at the community levels. Also, WhatsApp is an alternative, and the reason I say this is because sometimes the shutdown is focused on the big players like Twitter and Facebook, and WhatsApp as a relatively less data intensive platform is not as inaccessible. So there we've got engagement going on with messages forwarded, communities being created, engagements being vibrant across ages, across race, across class, across gender. And so that for me is a real alternative as well. I think that we need to be careful with litigation. Litigation as a last resort is excellent. And I would never say let's not litigate at all. The only challenge I have with litigation is that increasingly on the continent, we're seeing lack of respect for court rulings, whether it's South Africa or Zambia or elsewhere. But increasingly politicians are saying stuff that I'm not going to listen, and what are you going to do for me? To me. And that for me challenges the legitimacy of the judicial system in such a big way. And we know that the judicial system, its legitimacy derives from trust of the citizenry. So I think that's something we can maybe also talk about a little bit further. The other thought is challenging the private sector, as I've tried to demonstrate again. This should have equal focus as we do with governments because of the relationship between the two sides of the coin. I think close to ending now, the political systems that we have on the continent generally are winner takes all. So it's a competition to the death, right? And it's a fight to the death. So an incumbent is going to do everything that they can do to secure their position, because they know that if they don't win, then themselves, their patronage systems, their funders, and everybody else is going to be out and somebody else is going to be in. So maybe we also need to be talking about the political system as a driver for the shutdowns and attacks on democracy. And electoral capture is a big issue that we need to be talking about as well as one of the cogs of a general capture conversation. And then the very, very last thing I'm going to say, thanks for the indulgence, colleagues, is that solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. I think a lot of presidents on the continent and a lot of leaders are still moved by popular opinion and struggles that go beyond our national borders. And so I think the internet gives us that opportunity, and we should leverage it as much as we can, and not outsource our agency to your SADCs, your AUs, your ECOWASs, because that hasn't taken us very far. So I think citizen activism, engagement, and solidarity are the last things I'd like to say. Thank you.
And then I think from my side, just on that last point of prejudices always being there, I agree. Prejudices are always going to be there. The question is whether or not we are prepared to deal with the amplifying effects of the internet on those prejudices. That I think is the crucial consideration. Never in the history of humankind have you been able to as effectively spread hate, disinformation as you are able to now. Even this webinar is a platform we could have used, or rather abused, to put hate speech out there, disinformation, and I think that's one of the concerns that I think we shouldn't ignore. But yeah, to end off, Africa has one of the lowest internet penetrations on the continent, in the world actually, and as connectivity increases, there will be only more and more opportunities for us to engage with our politics and also use the internet to affect it. The only question now is what's the best method to do this, and how can we put some of the strategies we've devised in this webinar into practice? Thank you all for joining us. I'm looking forward to the next one.